My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who would count pennies at the grocery store checkout, holding up the line while I decided between milk for my children or gasoline for my car. But life has a way of humbling you in the most unexpected moments, stripping away every assumption you've made about your own strength and resilience. I lived, in a small rental house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where the autumn wind carries the scent of corn harvest and promises of a harsh winter ahead. The house wasn't much to look at. White paint peeling from wooden siding, a front porch that creaked with every footstep, and windows that rattled when trucks passed by. But it was ours, in the way that rented spaces become home when you've poured your heart into every corner, hung your children's artwork on every wall, and made countless memories within those thin walls. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. I worked 2 jobs to keep that home afloat. Days at Miller's hardware store on Main Street, where Mr. Miller treated me with the kindness of a grandfather I never had, and evenings cleaning offices downtown, when the city grew quiet and lonely. My hands knew the texture of every wrench in aisle 3, the weight of industrial-strength floor cleaner, and the exhaustion that settled into my bones around midnight when I'd finally collapse into bed. My children, Emma and Lucas, are my heartbeat made visible. Emma, 12 years old with strawberry blonde hair that refuses to stay tamed, carries herself with the seriousness of someone who's learned too young that life requires vigilance. Lucas, my 8-year-old dreamer, still believes in superheroes and happy endings, though I've caught glimpses of worry in his green eyes when he thinks I'm not looking. They've adapted to our rhythm of scarcity, with a grace that both breaks my heart and fills me with fierce pride. The morning that changed everything started like any other. October frost painted intricate patterns on our kitchen window, while I stirred instant oatmeal on the stove, the same breakfast we'd shared for weeks because it was filling and affordable. Emma packed her backpack methodically, checking twice for her library book, a habit born from knowing we couldn't afford to pay late fees. Lucas practiced spelling words aloud, his voice carrying the musical cadence of childhood, oblivious to the stack of unopened envelopes that had been growing on the kitchen counter for days. I knew those envelopes contained storms, past due notices from the electric company, warnings from the landlord, reminders that our small world was balanced on the edge of a precipice I'd been trying not to see. But that morning, with my children's laughter echoing through our little kitchen, I convinced myself we had more time. I told myself that my next paycheck would stretch further, that Mr. Miller might have extra hours available, that somehow the mathematics of survival would work in our favor. The knock on the door came at 9:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was watching the clock, counting minutes until I needed to leave for work. Emma had already caught the school bus, her serious face pressed against the window in a goodbye that would haunt me later. Lucas was playing with toy cars on the living room carpet, creating elaborate traffic patterns that made perfect sense in his 8-year-old world. The knocking wasn't gentle or polite. It carried authority and impatience, the sound of someone accustomed to delivering news that changes lives. Through the peephole, I saw a tall man in a dark suit, holding papers that I knew would contain words like eviction and final notice and 30 days that had somehow shrunk to 0. My hands trembled as I unlocked the door, though I tried to steady my voice when I spoke. "Good morning," I said, as if politeness could somehow soften whatever was coming. "Sarah Mitchell." His voice was flat, professional, empty of the warmth that human voices should carry when addressing another human being in crisis. "I'm here on behalf of Riverside Property Management. You need to vacate these premises immediately." The word "immediately" hit me like a physical blow. I'd expected more time, had been counting on the legal protections I'd heard about, the procedures that were supposed to give families like ours a chance to find alternatives. But apparently, those protections had deadlines, and I'd missed them while focusing on making it through each individual day. "There must be some mistake," I heard myself saying, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. "I've been making payments. I sent something just 2 weeks ago." He consulted his papers with the casual efficiency of someone who'd delivered this news countless times before. Partial payments don't constitute fulfillment of the lease agreement. Mrs. Mitchell, you're currently 3 months behind. The court order was issued last week. You need to remove your belongings today. The world tilted sideways. 3 months behind seemed impossible. But as I mentally calculated missed hours at work when Lucas had been sick, the reduced shifts at the hardware store during the slow season, the choice between rent and electricity, between rent and groceries, between rent and Emma's winter coat, I realized how the numbers had accumulated beyond my control. Lucas looked up from his cars, sensing the tension that had filled our living room like smoke. "Mom, is everything okay?" I forced a smile, the way mothers do when they're trying to hold the world together with nothing but willpower and love. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Keep playing." But everything wasn't fine. Everything was about to fall apart in ways I couldn't have imagined during all those nights when I lay awake calculating and recalculating our meager budget, trying to make the numbers work through sheer determination. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Collapse. The man from Riverside Property Management wasn't cruel by nature, I realized later. He was simply someone who had learned to insulate himself from the human cost of his job, to deliver life-altering news with the emotional distance of someone reading the weather forecast. But at that moment, standing in my doorway with Lucas playing innocently behind me, his detachment felt like cruelty. "You have until 2 p.m. to gather your belongings," he continued, consulting his watch with practiced efficiency. "After that, anything remaining will be considered abandoned property." 2 p.m. I looked at the clock. 10:15 a.m. Less than 4 hours to dismantle a life, to pack up the accumulation of years into whatever containers I could find, to somehow explain to my children that home was no longer home. "Please," I said, and hated how small my voice sounded. "I have children. Emma's at school. She doesn't even know. Can't we have until this evening? Just until—" "Ma'am, I understand this is difficult, but the order is clear. 2 p.m. today." He handed me the papers with movements that spoke of routine, of a job he'd performed so many times that the human drama had worn smooth into administrative process. I took the documents with hands that felt disconnected from my body, watching him walk away with steps that carried no weight, no acknowledgement of the devastation he'd just delivered. The papers felt heavier than they should have, dense with legal language that translated into simple, devastating reality. We had nowhere to go. Lucas appeared beside me, his small hand slipping into mine. "Mom, who was that man?" I knelt to his eye level, trying to find words that would be honest without being terrifying. "We need to pack some things today, buddy. We're going to stay somewhere else for a while." His green eyes, so much like his father's had been, studied my face with the intuitive wisdom that children develop when their world requires careful navigation. "Are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-up things are complicated, but we're not in trouble. We're just going to have an adventure." The word adventure tasted like ash in my mouth, but Lucas smiled with the trust that children place in their parents, the faith that mom's words can make even the impossible manageable. I held that smile in my memory like a photograph, knowing I'd need it in the hours to come. I called the hardware store first, my fingers struggling with the familiar numbers. "Mr. Miller, it's Sarah. I won't be able to come in today. Or tomorrow. I'm sorry. Sarah, girl, what's wrong? You sound like the world's ending." His kindness almost broke me. "We're being evicted. Today. I have to find somewhere for my kids to stay. And I don't know how I'm going to—" "Now hold on. Where are you going to go?" That was the question that had been echoing in my mind since the man in the suit walked away. Family wasn't an option. My parents had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, and my sister lived in California with problems of her own. Friends were scarce. The demands of working 2 jobs while raising children alone didn't leave much time for cultivating relationships that could withstand this kind of crisis. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "Maybe a motel until I can figure something out." Even as I said it, I was calculating. Motels cost money I didn't have, and even the cheapest ones would drain my meager savings within days. Shelters were a possibility, but the thought of taking Emma and Lucas to a place where strangers slept in rows, where privacy was a luxury and safety was never guaranteed, made my stomach clench. Mr. Miller was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, you know I'd help if I could. Business has been slow, and my wife's medical bills." "I know, Mr. Miller. I understand. You've already done more for us than you had to." After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen looking at the coffee mug Emma had made me in art class 2 years ago, decorated with wonky flowers and the words, "World's Best Mom," written in her careful child's handwriting. The ceramic felt warm in my hands, holding heat that would soon be just memory. I started with our clothes, stuffing everything into garbage bags because I couldn't find enough suitcases or boxes. Each item carried weight beyond its physical mass. Lucas's favorite superhero shirt, worn soft from countless washes, Emma's school clothes that she'd chosen so carefully each morning, my work uniforms that represented the stability I was losing. The hardest part was deciding what to leave behind. Books, because they were heavy, and we'd have nowhere to store them. Kitchen appliances that had served us faithfully but would have no counter to sit on. Furniture that wouldn't fit in my car and couldn't be moved without help I couldn't afford. I called the school next, speaking to Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who'd always been kind to both my children. "I need Emma to come home early today," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's a family emergency." "Of course. Should I have her gather her things from her locker?" "Yes, all of her things." The pause that followed told me Mrs. Rodriguez understood more than my words had revealed. Teachers see the signs. The children who wear the same clothes multiple days, who linger at school because home isn't safe or stable, who carry worries too heavy for small shoulders. "Sarah," she said gently, "if there's anything the school can do to help." "Thank you," I whispered, because saying more would have opened the floodgates I was barely holding closed. By noon, I had filled my small sedan with everything that remained of our life together. Clothes crammed into every available space, a box of photographs and important documents, a few of the children's most treasured possessions. The car sagged under the weight of our displaced existence, looking like exactly what it was, the vehicle of people who no longer had a place to belong. Emma arrived home on the early dismissal bus, her serious face immediately taking in the scene of packed bags and emptied rooms. She was 12 going on 40, my Emma, old enough to understand crisis even when I tried to wrap it in careful words. "We're leaving, aren't we?" she said simply. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She walked through the house once more, her fingers trailing along walls she'd known her entire conscious life. When she returned to where Lucas and I waited by the car, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her chin was lifted with a determination that reminded me of my own mother. "Where are we going to live now?" she asked. "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but we'll figure it out. Together." Chapter 3. The sound of doors closing. At exactly 2 p.m., the man in the dark suit returned, this time accompanied by 2 workers in coveralls and a locksmith whose tools gleamed like surgical instruments. I watched from the sidewalk as they changed the locks on what had been our front door just hours earlier, the sound of metal turning echoing in the October air with a finality that made my chest tight. Emma stood beside me holding Lucas's hand, her 12-year-old composure more steady than mine. Lucas pressed his face against my leg, overwhelmed by the surreal nature of watching strangers claim ownership of his bedroom, his toy box, his sense of home. The workers moved efficiently through our discarded life, carrying out furniture and belongings with the brisk indifference of people paid to clean up other people's failures. "Mom, where's Mr. Buttons?" Lucas asked suddenly, his voice pitched high with the panic that comes when children realize something precious has been forgotten. Mr. Buttons was his stuffed elephant, gray and worn from years of bedtime comfort. I closed my eyes and saw him sitting on Lucas's unmade bed, waiting faithfully for a return that would never come. The workers had already locked the house. Mr. Buttons was trapped inside with the ghosts of our former life. "I'm sorry, baby," I whispered, kneeling to hold him as his small body shook with the first real tears of the day. "I'm so sorry." The motel I chose was called the Cedar Inn, though there were no cedar trees in sight. and it bore no resemblance to any inn I'd ever imagined. The paint was the color of defeat, a beige that had given up on being attractive, and the parking lot was cracked asphalt where weeds pushed through with stubborn hope. But it was $49 a night, the cheapest I could find, and the clerk accepted cash without asking too many questions about our circumstances. Room 23 smelled of industrial disinfectant and cigarettes from previous guests, with undertones of desperation that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. 2 double beds dominated the small space, their floral bedspreads faded to the color of old dishwater. A television sat chained to a dresser, its screen reflecting our displaced faces like a funhouse mirror. Emma set her backpack on the bed closest to the window and began unpacking with the methodical efficiency she'd inherited from me. Lucas climbed onto the other bed and bounced once, testing the springs, before curling into a ball around the empty space where Mr. Buttons should have been. "This is temporary," I announced to the room, to my children, to myself, "just until I can find us something better." But even as I spoke the words, I was calculating days against dollars. At $49 a night, my savings would last exactly 12 days. 12 days to find a job that paid better, an apartment that cost less, a miracle that would restore the stability I'd worked so hard to create and lost so completely. The first night was the longest of my life. Emma and Lucas fell asleep eventually, exhaustion overcoming the strangeness of our surroundings. I lay awake listening to the sounds that filtered through thin walls. Televisions too loud, voices raised in argument, footsteps that carried the restlessness of other displaced souls. At 3 a.m., a couple in the next room began shouting. Their words were muffled, but their anger was crystal clear, punctuated by the sound of something heavy hitting the wall. Lucas stirred in his sleep, reaching for comfort that wasn't there. I moved to his bed and held him, his small body warm and trusting against mine, while I stared at the ceiling and wondered how we'd fallen so far so fast. The next morning brought new challenges wrapped in the routine of survival. The motel had no continental breakfast, no coffee maker, no refrigerator. I used the last $5 bill in my wallet to buy instant oatmeal and plastic spoons from a gas station, mixing it with hot water from the bathroom tap while Emma and Lucas got dressed for school. "Will we still go to the same school?" Emma asked, her voice carefully neutral. "For now," I said, though I had no idea how we'd manage transportation if we ended up moving farther from town. My car was reliable but old, and gas money was becoming as precious as rent money had been. Getting the children ready for school from a motel room felt like performing familiar choreography on an unfamiliar stage. Everything was wrong. No kitchen table for breakfast, no entryway for backpacks, no sense of home to anchor the morning routine. But Emma and Lucas adapted with the resilience of childhood, finding ways to make the strange space functional. After I dropped them off, I spent the day driving through Cedar Falls looking for rent signs and help wanted notices. The apartment listings were depressingly familiar. First month, last month, security deposit, credit check, references. Requirements that made sense from a landlord's perspective, but created insurmountable barriers for someone whose recent eviction had shattered their rental history. The job search was equally frustrating. Retail positions that paid minimum wage with no benefits. Office work that required skills I didn't have, or experience I couldn't afford to gain. Restaurant jobs with schedules that would make childcare impossible. Everything seemed designed for people whose lives had more stability than mine currently possessed. By evening, I'd accomplished nothing except using a tank of gas I couldn't afford, and confirming what I already suspected. Climbing out of homelessness required resources that homeless people, by definition, didn't have. The second night at the Cedar Inn was quieter, but no less difficult. Emma did her homework using the dim light from the bedside lamp, her pencil scratching across paper with the determined focus of a child who understands that education is the bridge to a better future. Lucas played with the few toys we'd managed to save, creating elaborate scenarios where superheroes rescued families and everyone got to go home safely. "Mom," Emma said as I tucked her into the unfamiliar bed, "it's going to be okay, right?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with the trust she was placing in me to provide certainty in an uncertain world. I smoothed her strawberry blonde hair away from her face and kissed her forehead, buying time while I searched for words that would be honest without being hopeless. "We're going to take it one day at a time," I said finally. "And whatever happens, we'll face it together." It wasn't the reassurance she'd been hoping for, but it was the truth. And at 12 years old, Emma was wise enough to recognize truth when she heard it, even when it wasn't comfortable. Chapter 4. When Hope Becomes Arithmetic. By the 5th day at the Cedar Inn, our routine had developed the brittle efficiency of people adapting to circumstances they never thought they'd face. Emma woke first, as she always had, her internal clock undisturbed by the upheaval of our living situation. Lucas required more coaxing. Confused by mornings that began in a room that smelled wrong and felt wrong, without the familiar sounds of our old neighborhood, I'd learned to budget our mornings precisely: 15 minutes to get dressed, 10 minutes for instant oatmeal mixed with lukewarm tap water, 5 minutes to pack backpacks and gather the scattered pieces of our temporary existence. The mathematics of poverty had become my constant companion, calculating gas money against food money, counting days of motel fees against the dwindling balance in my checking account. The night manager at the Cedar Inn was a woman named Dorothy, who wore her gray hair in a practical bun and kept reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She'd seen enough desperation to recognize it in others, and her eyes held a mixture of sympathy and professional distance when I approached her desk on that 5th evening. "I need to ask about a payment extension," I said, the words scraping against my throat like sandpaper. Dorothy looked at me over her glasses with the expression of someone who'd heard this request countless times. "How long do you need?" "Just a few days, maybe a week. I have job interviews lined up. And once I start working..." "Mrs. Mitchell," she interrupted gently, "I've been doing this job for 23 years. I've heard every story, and I believe most of them are true. But I don't make the rules about payment." I stared at the fake wood grain of her desk, counting the swirled patterns while I fought against the panic rising in my chest. "What happens if I can't pay tomorrow?" "You'll need to find somewhere else to stay." Somewhere else. The phrase echoed in my mind as I walked back to room 23, past doors behind which other families might be having similar conversations. Other mothers calculating impossible mathematics. Emma looked up from her homework when I entered, reading my expression with the intuitive accuracy of a child who'd learned to navigate by her mother's moods. "What did she say?" Emma asked. "We might need to find a different place to stay soon," I said, aiming for casual, but hearing the strain in my own voice. Lucas looked up from his coloring book, his crayon frozen halfway through what might have been a house or a tree. "Another motel." I sat on the edge of his bed and smoothed his dark hair, buying time while I searched for words that wouldn't frighten him. Maybe, or maybe something different. We'll see. But privately, I was running through options that grew more limited with each passing hour. The homeless shelter in Cedar Falls had a waiting list and strict rules about families with children. My car was too small to sleep in comfortably, and the October nights were growing cold enough to make sleeping outdoors dangerous. Friends and extended family had receded into the category of people who meant well, but couldn't absorb the weight of our crisis. That night, after Emma and Lucas had fallen asleep, I sat in the plastic chair by the window and tried to pray. It had been years since I'd done more than occasional desperate bargaining with God. Please let the car start. Please let Emma's cough be nothing serious. Please let the check arrive on time. But sitting in a $49 motel room with 2 sleeping children and less than $60 to my name, I found myself reaching for faith like a drowning person reaching for driftwood. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," I whispered to the darkness outside our window. "I've tried everything I know how to try." The silence that followed felt vast and empty, filled only with the distant sound of traffic on the interstate and the mechanical hum of the heating unit that cycled on and off throughout the night. If God was listening, He wasn't offering immediate solutions to the immediate crisis of homelessness with children. The 6th day brought rain, a cold, persistent drizzle that made everything gray and miserable. I dropped Emma and Lucas at school and spent the morning at the Department of Human Services, sitting in a waiting room that smelled of industrial coffee and bureaucratic fatigue. The caseworker who finally called my name was younger than I'd expected. with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that carried the professional compassion of someone who'd seen too much human suffering. Emergency housing assistance has a 3-month waiting list, she explained, consulting forms that contained the accumulated details of our catastrophe. Food assistance we can process today, but temporary shelter placement is more complicated. The food stamps would help, $43 per week for a family of 3, but it wouldn't solve the immediate problem of having nowhere to sleep after tonight. She gave me a list of churches that sometimes offered emergency assistance, along with phone numbers for organizations that provided meals and clothing donations. The Salvation Army sometimes has emergency vouchers, she suggested, and St. Matthew's Church runs a family program, though they're usually full. I thanked her and walked back to my car through rain that seemed designed to underscore the bleakness of our situation. The list of phone numbers in my hand represented the thin network of safety nets that caught people like us. Sometimes, when funding was available, when space allowed, when circumstances aligned in the precise configuration that bureaucracy required. The first 3 churches I called were sympathetic but unable to help. The fourth, St. Matthew's on Elm Street, put me on hold for several minutes before a woman named Janet came to the phone. "I'm sorry, but our emergency housing fund was depleted last week," she said. "However, we're serving dinner tonight at 6 if your family needs a meal." A free dinner meant money saved for another night's motel fee. I accepted gratefully and spent the rest of the afternoon at the public library with Emma and Lucas after school, where we could sit somewhere warm and quiet while I continued making phone calls to landlords who wouldn't accept applicants with recent evictions and employers who needed workers but couldn't accommodate single mothers with limited availability. The dinner at St. Matthew's was served in a fellowship hall that smelled of coffee and casseroles. Long tables covered in white plastic cloths were surrounded by families like ours, tired-looking adults and children who'd learned to be grateful for places that offered both food and dignity. Emma and Lucas ate quietly, observing the other children with the cautious interest of people learning to navigate new social territory. The volunteers serving food were relentlessly cheerful in the way that meant well, but sometimes felt exhausting to receive. They asked how we were doing with voices that expected optimism in response, and I found myself manufacturing smiles and reassurances that everything would work out fine. It was easier than explaining that fine felt like a foreign concept, that working out required resources we didn't have. After dinner, we returned to the Cedar Inn for what I suspected would be our last night. I'd managed to scrape together enough money for one more day, but beyond that, the arithmetic became impossible. Dorothy's expression when I paid was kind but resigned, the look of someone who'd watched this scenario play out too many times to believe in happy endings. "There's a family shelter in Des Moines," she said quietly as she processed my payment. "About an hour's drive. Sometimes they have space when the local places are full." Des Moines felt like giving up, like admitting that Cedar Falls, the only home Emma and Lucas had ever known, could no longer contain us. But as I lay awake that night listening to my children's breathing and calculating distances against gas money, Des Moines began to feel like the only direction left that offered any possibility at all. Chapter 5. The Pavement Prayers. October 15th dawned gray and bitter, with the kind of cold that cuts through layers of clothing and settles deep in your bones. I woke before the alarm, having barely slept on the motel's unforgiving mattress, my mind cycling through scenarios that all led to the same impossible conclusion. After today, we had nowhere to go. The shower at the Cedar Inn produced lukewarm water that smelled faintly of sulfur, but I let it run over my face longer than necessary, hoping the steam might wash away the exhaustion that had taken up permanent residence behind my eyes. In the foggy mirror, I looked like someone I didn't recognize, hollow-cheeked and desperate, the kind of woman I used to see at bus stops and grocery stores, and wonder what choices had led her to such obvious struggle. Emma was already awake when I emerged from the bathroom, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her homework spread around her like a paper fortress. She'd inherited my tendency to seek control through organization, arranging her school materials with precise care even in the chaos of our displaced existence. "Mom," she said, without looking up from her math worksheet, "I heard you crying last night." The words hit me like cold water. I'd thought I'd been quiet, had pressed my face into the thin motel pillow to muffle the sounds of my breaking down. But Emma noticed everything, had always been too aware for her own good. "Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're worried," I said, sitting beside her on the bed that smelled of industrial detergent and other people's troubles. "It doesn't mean anything bad is going to happen." She looked at me then, with those serious eyes that seemed far too old for 12. "Are we going to be homeless?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. Emma had always preferred truth to comfortable lies, but I'd been trying to shield her from the full weight of our situation. Apparently, my efforts at protection had been less successful than I'd hoped. "We're going to figure something out," I said, which wasn't exactly an answer but was the most honesty I could manage without completely falling apart. Lucas woke slowly, as he always did, rubbing his eyes and looking around the motel room with the confused expression of someone trying to remember why nothing looked familiar. For just a moment, I saw him start to look for Mr. Buttons before memory settled back into place, and his face crumpled with the fresh grief of loss. Getting them ready for school felt like performing a play I'd rehearsed too many times. The cheerful mother maintaining routine in the face of catastrophe. Instant oatmeal mixed with hope and desperation. Backpacks packed with the careful precision of people who couldn't afford to forget anything. Shoes tied with fingers that trembled more than they should. "Will you pick us up from school today?" Lucas asked as I walked them to the car. "Of course, buddy. Same time as always." But even as I said it, I was calculating hours and options. If Dorothy at the Cedar Inn meant what she'd said about payment, we'd be locked out by afternoon. The shelter in Des Moines might have space, or it might not. The list of churches and organizations in my purse might yield emergency help. Or it might just be paper filled with sympathetic voices explaining why they couldn't assist. After dropping the children at school, I spent the morning making calls from the parking lot of a grocery store, my phone battery dying as slowly as my optimism. Each conversation followed the same pattern: concern, sympathy, regret, referral to someone else who might be able to help. The network of social services that was supposed to catch falling families turned out to be more like a spider web, intricately connected, but full of holes. By noon, I'd exhausted every option on my list except one: calling my sister Rebecca in California. We hadn't spoken in 2 years. Not since Dad's funeral, when family tensions had exploded into the kind of fight that leaves permanent scars. Rebecca had her own struggles: a divorce, job instability, depression that had kept her barely afloat since high school. But she was family, and family was supposed to matter when everything else failed. "Sarah?" Her voice carried surprise and wariness in equal measure. "What's wrong?" I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear someone say my name with recognition, with the kind of familiarity that comes from shared history. The sound of it almost broke my composure entirely. "We're in trouble, Becca. Emma and Lucas and I. We got evicted, and I don't know what to do." The silence that followed stretched across 2,000 miles and 2 years of unresolved anger. When Rebecca finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "How much do you need?" The question was practical, which meant she was considering helping, which meant I wasn't completely alone in the universe. But it also meant reducing our crisis to numbers. And the numbers were larger than what anyone could reasonably be expected to provide. "It's not just money," I said. "We need a place to stay, and I need time to find work, and the kids need stability." "Sarah, I can't. I'm living in a studio apartment, and I just got laid off last month. I'm barely keeping my own head above water." Of course she couldn't. I'd known it even as I dialed her number. But hope had made me try anyway. Hope was dangerous that way, making you reach for solutions that existed only in the realm of wishes. "I understand," I said, because what else could I say? I just thought, if things were different. She interrupted. "If I had more space, if I had steady income." "I know. It's okay. I'm sorry I bothered you." After I hung up, I sat in my car watching people go in and out of the grocery store, carrying bags full of the kind of routine purchases that represented stability. Milk that would go in their own refrigerators, bread that would sit on their own counters, choices made by people who had homes to return to. The afternoon pickup at school felt like a performance I was no longer capable of giving. Emma took one look at my face and knew that whatever options I'd been pursuing had failed. Lucas climbed into the back seat chattering about his day. blissfully unaware that it might be the last day he'd attend that particular school. "Where are we going?" Emma asked as I started the car. "Back to the motel for now," I said. "To get our things." Dorothy was behind the desk when we arrived, her expression sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mitchell. Checkout time was noon." I looked at the clock on the wall. 3:47 p.m., nearly 4 hours past the deadline, though I'd been hoping for flexibility that had never been promised. "I know I'm late. I was trying to find somewhere else to go. Could I just get our belongings?" She handed me the key with the gentleness of someone who'd delivered this particular disappointment before. "Take your time," she said quietly. Room 23 looked different in the afternoon light. Smaller, more pathetic, already emptying of the temporary life we'd tried to build within its walls. Emma and Lucas stood in the doorway, watching me pack our scattered possessions back into garbage bags and the few boxes I'd managed to acquire. "Where are we going to sleep tonight?" Lucas asked, his voice small and uncertain. I stopped folding clothes and knelt in front of him, taking his hands in mine. They were cold, though the room was warm, and I realized he'd been afraid for hours without knowing how to express it. "I don't know yet, sweetheart. But we'll figure it out. We always do." It was a lie wrapped in hope, the kind of thing mothers say when they're trying to be braver than they feel. But Lucas nodded and hugged me with the fierce trust of childhood, and I held him close while Emma watched with eyes that understood too much. By the time we finished packing, the sky had turned the color of pewter, heavy with the promise of rain. Everything we owned fit into my sedan with room to spare, a mathematical proof of how little remained of the life we'd been building before it all collapsed. I drove aimlessly through Cedar Falls, while Emma and Lucas sat quietly in the back seat, past the elementary school where they'd attended morning classes just hours earlier, past the hardware store where I'd worked before crisis made employment impossible, past the house on Maple Street, where someone else now lived behind the windows that had once framed our ordinary happiness. The rain started as evening settled over the city, fat drops that exploded against the windshield with increasing frequency. I pulled into the parking lot of a fast food restaurant, not because we could afford to eat there, but because I needed to stop driving and think. "Are we going to sleep in the car?" Emma asked, her voice matter-of-fact in the way that meant she'd already accepted this possibility. "Maybe tonight," I admitted. "Just until tomorrow, when I can make some more calls." She nodded as if spending the night in a car was a reasonable solution to homelessness, which it wasn't. But what choice did we have? The shelter in Des Moines might be full. The churches had already exhausted their emergency funds. The elaborate safety net that was supposed to exist for families in crisis had revealed itself to be full of holes large enough for people like us to fall through. As darkness settled around us and the rain drummed against the roof of our car, I realized we'd reached the bottom of the fall I'd been dreading for months. There were no more phone calls to make, no more options to pursue, no more ways to postpone the moment when survival became a question of simply enduring what came next. I started the engine and drove to the parking lot of St. Matthew's Church, where we'd had dinner the night before. The building was dark and empty, but the parking lot was illuminated by streetlights that cast long shadows across the asphalt. It seemed like the safest place I could think of to spend the night, surrounded by the symbolic protection of faith, even if actual help had proven elusive. I turned off the engine and listened to the rain, which had intensified into the kind of downpour that makes everything gray and cold and hopeless. Emma and Lucas were quiet in the back seat, processing the reality of our situation with the resilience that children develop when circumstances require it. "Mom," Lucas said softly, I'm scared." I climbed into the back seat and pulled both children close, feeling their warm bodies against mine in the cramped space that had become our shelter. "I'm scared too, baby, but we're together, and that's what matters." Outside our car, the rain fell with relentless intensity, washing away the last remnants of the life we'd lost, and leaving us with nothing but each other and the faith that somehow, from somewhere, help would come. Shati Chapter 6. When Heaven Bent Down. The rain fell with the kind of intensity that seems personal, as if the sky had chosen our particular moment of devastation to unleash its fury. Inside our car, condensation fogged the windows, creating a humid cocoon that smelled of fear and exhaustion. Emma had finally fallen asleep against my shoulder, her 12-year-old body folded awkwardly in the cramped back seat. Lucas lay across our laps, using my jacket as a blanket, his breathing steady but restless. I hadn't slept at all. Every sound outside made me alert. Footsteps on wet pavement, car doors slamming, the distant wail of sirens that might or might not be coming for us. The parking lot of St. Matthew's Church had seemed safe in the evening light, but darkness transformed it into something uncertain and potentially dangerous. At 3 a.m., the rain intensified into what felt like punishment from heaven. Water hammered against our car with such force that I wondered if the windows might break, if the storm might literally wash us away along with what remained of our dignity. Lucas stirred and whimpered in his sleep, reaching for comfort that existed only in dreams. That's when the doubt hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and replacing it with something that felt like drowning. I'd failed. After years of working 2 jobs, of sacrificing every personal want for my children's needs, of believing that effort and determination would be enough to keep us safe, I'd failed completely and spectacularly. The God I'd been raised to trust, the faith I'd clung to through my husband's death, and the grinding poverty that followed, felt as absent as the dry warmth we needed. Where was divine providence when children slept in cars? Where was holy protection when mothers had exhausted every option except despair? I thought about Michael, my husband, dead 3 years from a heart attack at 34. He'd been the steady one, the problem solver, the man who could fix anything from leaky faucets to broken dreams. If he'd lived, we would never have ended up here. The insurance money had carried us for a while, but medical bills and funeral costs, and the reality of single-parent economics, had eroded that buffer until nothing remained but the monthly struggle that had led to this moment. I can't do this anymore, I whispered to the rain-streaked windows, to the empty parking lot, to the God who seemed to have abandoned us completely. I don't know how to fix this. The admission felt like the final surrender. The moment when fighting became pointless, because there was nothing left to fight with. My children deserved better than a mother who'd lost the ability to provide basic shelter. They deserved stability, safety, the kind of childhood that didn't include sleeping in cars or wondering where the next meal would come from. Emma stirred against my shoulder, and I realized my tears had been falling onto her hair, even in sleep. She sensed my distress, her face tightening with worry that had become as familiar as breathing. I tried to stop crying, but the tears seemed to have their own momentum, carrying away the last of my strength along with the pretense that I could handle this crisis alone. At 4:17 a.m., according to the digital clock on my dashboard, something changed. I can't explain what happened next in any way that makes rational sense. I wasn't hallucinating from exhaustion, wasn't dreaming despite my sleepless state. But in that moment when my despair felt complete and absolute, I became aware of a presence in our car that hadn't been there before. The temperature didn't change. The sound of rain didn't diminish. But suddenly I wasn't alone in my terror and helplessness. Someone was with us in that cramped space. Someone whose presence carried such profound peace that my tears stopped falling, and my racing heart began to slow. I looked up through the fogged passenger window and saw a figure standing in the rain beside our car. A man, tall and calm, wearing clothes that should have been soaked through but somehow weren't. The parking lot lights seemed to bend around him, creating illumination that defied the storm's darkness. I knew, with the kind of certainty that bypasses rational thought, that I was looking at Jesus. He didn't appear in glory or surrounded by angels. There was no voice from heaven, no miraculous transformation of our circumstances. He simply stood there in the rain, looking at our car with eyes that held all the compassion I'd been desperately seeking. When our eyes met through the glass, I felt something break open inside my chest, not breaking in the way that creates more pain, but breaking in the way that allows light into dark places. I'd been carrying our crisis alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen by someone who understood. His expression held no judgment for my failures, no impatience with my desperation. Instead, I saw the kind of love that mothers feel for their children, protective, unconditional, willing to absorb any amount of pain to provide comfort. But this love was larger than anything human, vast enough to encompass not just my immediate need, but every broken heart that had ever cried out in darkness. I wanted to wake Emma and Lucas, wanted them to see what I was seeing, but something told me this moment was meant for me alone. This was the answer to prayers I'd been too proud or too exhausted to properly pray. The response to the question I'd been asking in the deepest parts of my heart. Are we alone in this? Without speaking aloud, I heard his answer. You are not alone. You have never been alone. The rain continued to fall, but it no longer felt like an assault. Instead, it seemed like cleansing, washing away the shame and self-recrimination that had been poisoning my ability to think clearly. I understood, with sudden clarity, that our homelessness wasn't evidence of divine abandonment, but part of a journey I couldn't see the end of yet. I don't know what to do, I whispered, speaking to him through the glass that separated us, but somehow didn't diminish the connection I felt. Trust, came the wordless response. Trust and rest. Rest. The concept seemed impossible in our current circumstances, but as I looked at his face, kind beyond description, patient beyond human understanding, I felt my muscles begin to relax for the first time in days. The knot of anxiety in my chest started to loosen. Not because our situation had changed, but because I was no longer carrying it entirely alone. He stayed with us until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, his presence as steady as breathing, as reliable as heartbeat. When the first pale light made the rain visible as individual drops instead of a gray wall of water, he smiled, the kind of smile that contains infinite tenderness, and I knew he was preparing to leave. But before he faded back into the ordinary world of parking lots and storm clouds, he spoke one final message that I felt, rather than heard. Help is coming. The rain stopped at 6:23 a.m., as abruptly as it had begun. One moment our car was surrounded by the sound of water against metal and glass, and the next moment there was only silence and the gradually brightening sky. Emma and Lucas woke slowly, stretching in the cramped space and looking around with the confusion of people who'd spent the night somewhere they didn't belong. Mom, Emma said, studying my face with the careful attention she always paid to my moods. You look different. I felt different. The crushing weight of hopelessness that had pressed against my chest for hours was gone, replaced by something I hadn't experienced in so long I'd almost forgotten its name. Peace. I think things are going to be okay, I said. And for the first time in days, I meant it. Lucas sat up and rubbed his eyes, looking out the window at the church parking lot that sparkled with rain puddles reflecting the morning sky. Can we go inside? He asked. I need to use the bathroom. It was such an ordinary request, the kind of practical need that hadn't stopped existing just because we'd lost our home. But as I looked at the church building, really looked at it for the first time since we'd arrived the night before, I noticed something I'd missed in the darkness. There was a sign by the front entrance, small and unobtrusive, that read, Family Emergency Shelter. Open daily. 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Inquire at office. My heart began to beat faster, not with anxiety this time, but with the kind of hope that feels like coming alive. I'd driven past this sign dozens of times over the past week, had even attended dinner here just 2 nights ago, but somehow I'd never seen it before this moment. Help was coming, just as he had promised. It had been here all along, waiting for me to be ready to see it. Then Chapter 7. The Architecture of Grace. The office of St. Matthew's Church smelled like coffee and copy paper, with undertones of the pine cleaner that churches always seem to use on their floors. Emma and Lucas sat in chairs that were too big for them, swinging their legs while they waited for me to finish the conversation that might change everything. The woman behind the desk was named Margaret Foster, and she had the kind of face that suggested she'd heard every possible variation of human crisis and responded to each one with practical compassion. She was probably 60, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain. How long have you been without housing? She asked, her pen poised over a form that represented either our salvation or another dead end. A week. We stayed at the Cedar Inn until yesterday, but I ran out of money. She nodded without judgment, making notes in handwriting that was precise and efficient. Previous address? 2847 Maple Street. We were evicted on October 10th. More notes. More questions about income, employment history. The reasons for our housing crisis that boiled down to the simple mathematics of not having enough to cover both rent and food and utilities and all the other expenses that came with trying to raise children alone. The family shelter program can house up to 4 families at a time, Margaret explained, speaking directly to me but including Emma and Lucas in her attention. Each family gets their own room, shared kitchen and bathroom facilities, and access to case management services to help with job placement and permanent housing. It sounded too good to be true, like the answer to prayers I'd been afraid to pray completely. How long can families stay? Up to 90 days, with possible extension if you're making progress toward independence. 90 days. 3 months to find work, save money, locate an apartment that would accept tenants with damaged rental history. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was time. The one thing I'd been completely out of. Is there space available now? I asked, holding my breath while she consulted another form. Actually, yes. We had a family move into permanent housing yesterday, so we have 1 room available. She smiled at Emma and Lucas, who'd been listening to our conversation with the intense attention of children whose futures hung in the balance. And would you like to see it? The family shelter occupied the church's old Sunday school wing, a hallway lined with doors that had once led to classrooms, but now opened onto small apartments. Our room, was painted pale yellow and contained 2 twin beds, a dresser, a small table with 2 chairs, and a window that looked out onto the church playground. The beds can be pushed together if needed, Margaret explained. And we have extra blankets and pillows in the supply closet. The kitchen is communal, but each family has their own shelf in the refrigerator and cabinet space for dry goods. Lucas immediately went to the window and pressed his face against the glass. There's a playground, Mom. Can I go play after we move in? Move in. The words sounded impossibly hopeful, like something that happened to other people but never to us. But Margaret was nodding, explaining the shelter rules and orientation process with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who helped families transition from homelessness to stability every day. Dinner is served at 6:00, she continued, and there's a morning prayer service at 7:30 that's optional but encouraged. We ask that families contribute to household chores on a rotating basis, and everyone meets with a caseworker once a week to work on housing and employment goals. I signed papers that felt like hope made legal, providing references I wasn't sure would be helpful, and employment history that was sporadic, but honest. Margaret processed our application with the calm professionalism of someone who understood that bureaucracy could either be a barrier to help or a bridge to it, depending on how it was administered. You can move in this afternoon, she said, handing me a key that looked exactly like the key to any other door, but felt like the key to survival. Welcome to St. Matthew's Family Shelter. The first night in our room at the shelter, I lay awake not from anxiety, but from the unfamiliar sensation of safety. Emma and Lucas had pushed their beds together and fallen asleep holding hands, their faces peaceful in the dim light that filtered through our window from the parking lot security lights. For the first time in a week, I wasn't calculating money or contemplating worst-case scenarios. Instead, I found myself thinking about the figure I'd seen in the rain, the presence that had sat with us in our car during the darkest hours of our crisis, whether it had been Jesus himself or simply the manifestation of grace when I needed it most. The encounter had shifted something fundamental in how I understood our circumstances. We weren't just a family that had fallen through the cracks of an inadequate social safety net. We were people being carried through a storm by hands stronger than our own, guided toward help we hadn't been able to see until we stopped trying to solve everything alone. Over the following weeks, life at St. Matthew's developed its own rhythm. Emma and Lucas continued attending their same school, catching the city bus from the corner near the church. I met with my caseworker, Jennifer D., every Tuesday to apply for jobs and housing, slowly rebuilding the kind of stability that had seemed permanently lost. The other families in the shelter became our temporary community, people who understood without explanation what it felt like to measure security by the day. who celebrated small victories like approved rental applications and job interviews. We shared meals in the communal kitchen and watched our children play together in the small playground outside our window. Margaret was the steady presence that held everything together, checking on families with the perfect balance of support and respect for privacy. She never made anyone feel like charity cases or failures, but instead treated each family as temporarily displaced people working toward independence. On November 15th, exactly 5 weeks after moving into the shelter, I got a call that changed everything again, but this time, the change felt like flying instead of falling. Miller's Hardware had an opening for an assistant manager position, with better hours and benefits that would make renting an apartment financially possible. "Sarah, I've been hoping you'd come back," Mr. Miller said when I came in for the interview. "I know you've been going through a rough patch, but you're the most reliable person I've ever had working here." The apartment we found was small but clean, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that felt enormous compared to the shelter's shared facilities. The landlord required first month's rent and a security deposit, but Jennifer at the shelter helped me navigate the paperwork and financial assistance programs that made it possible. Moving day arrived on December 1st, with the first snow of winter falling softly outside our old room at St. Matthew's. Emma and Lucas packed their belongings, which had grown considerably during our shelter stay, thanks to donations and the kindness of the church community, with the excited energy of children who'd learned not to take home for granted. "Will we still come visit?" Lucas asked Margaret as we prepared to leave. "Anytime you want," she said, hugging him with the fierce affection of someone who'd watched him grow braver over the weeks. "You'll always be part of our family here." As I loaded our car with belongings that once again fit entirely in my sedan, I thought about the night in the parking lot when everything had seemed hopeless. The presence I'd felt that night hadn't removed our crisis or provided instant solutions, but it had given me the strength to accept help when it came, and the faith to believe that falling wasn't the same as failing. Our new apartment was only 6 blocks from St. Matthew's Church, close enough that we could walk back for the community dinners we'd grown to love, and far enough that it felt like the independence we'd been working toward. That first night, as I tucked Emma and Lucas into beds in their own room, I realized we'd not only survived homelessness, we'd been transformed by it. "Mom," Emma said as I turned off their bedroom light, "are you still scared sometimes?" It was the kind of question that required complete honesty, the kind of conversation that happened in the darkness between day and dreams. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but not the same way as before. Now, when I'm scared, I remember that we're not alone. Even when we can't see how things will work out, there are people who care about us, and there's love that's bigger than our problems." Lucas was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Like the man you saw in the car that night?" I'd never told them about my experience during the storm, but somehow Lucas had sensed it anyway, the way children sometimes perceive truths that adults try to keep hidden. "Yes," I said, "exactly like that." As I prepared for bed in my own room for the first time in months, I found myself looking out the window toward St. Matthew's Church, where other families were beginning their own journeys from desperation to hope. The snow was falling more heavily now, covering the streets and sidewalks with the kind of pristine whiteness that makes everything look clean and possible. I whispered a prayer of gratitude into the quiet darkness, not just for the apartment and the job and the restoration of basic stability, but for the lesson learned in our deepest crisis. That grace sometimes comes in the form of shelters and caseworkers and churches that open their doors to strangers, and that being found when you're lost is the most profound miracle of all. Outside my window, the snow continued to fall, gentle and persistent, covering the world with the promise of new beginnings. Dear listeners, we hope Sarah's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.